Brian Green, thank you so much for joining us for this interview. And here you are sitting at this desk, and I saw your name on the door as we walked in. How does it feel? What's going through your mind right now?
It's honestly been a little bit surreal. The job is very different than the job that I had here before. But when I first walked through the doors to move in, it really felt like a homecoming. I was immediately comfortable back in the office. I loved doing this kind of work. And even after I left the DA's office, I continued to do that in a couple of different capacities. So it felt great to come back.
So you're the Monroe County District Attorney now. What was the atmosphere like when you came in?
I'll be completely honest, it was lighter than I expected it to be. I had been talking with friends of mine who still work here in the lead up to the potential appointment. So I understood what the environment had been like while I'd been gone. And I think just a new administration breathed a little bit of life back into the office and helps make way for a change going forward.
You were the judge in Irondequoit. What type of cases were you working on in Irondequoit?
So town court judges in New York handle mostly misdemeanor cases. We handle violations and misdemeanor cases from start to finish. But we also handle felony cases at the outset, and or I should say they. And also they handle traffic matters, landlord-tenant matters, small claims. So it really runs the gamut. It's a full civil docket and a full criminal docket. One
of the cases that passed before you while you were there was one of the bigger cases in our area, the quadruple murder in Irondequoit. That case has been moved out of the Monroe County DA's office over to Wayne County, citing conflict of interest because you had handled it as a judge. Your thoughts on the transition over to Wayne County?
Sure. Well, just to be clear, it's not your standard type of conflict of interest.
Yeah,
there's Judiciary Law 17 says that a former judge can't act as an attorney or counselor in any way on a case that was before him in his official capacity. And I actually didn't handle much of the case. I only handled a very small portion. There was an arrest warrant that needed to be recalled, and I signed the recall. But that's enough to trigger the legal responsibility and the ethical responsibility. But Christine Callanan was an ADA here for many years before she went out to Wayne County. She actually worked for me in the Major Felony Bureau here when I was the deputy chief for about 3 years, 3.5 years. She's incredibly smart, she's driven, and she's a fantastic prosecutor. So I have no doubt that case will be handled appropriately as it goes forward.
How does that work when it transfers over? Will she and her team get briefed by the team here at Monroe County DA, or is it immediately like cut off and they can't have anything to do with it?
No, they'll be briefed. The statute says that and as a result, the office can't act as an attorney or counselor. But I've spoken with the judges who are involved in the appointment process of special DAs for all of the cases that we had to let go of. And there is an understanding that this office does, in addition to statutorily being required to turn over the files, there's a facilitation of sorts that has to happen so that the new prosecutors can be fully up to speed and ready to go. So we are transferring the physical files and the digital files, but we are also allowing them to speak with the ADAs who were formerly assigned to the cases to get an understanding of where the case was and where it's gone. And also, because discovery is handled digitally now for the most part through the portal that we have online, we are facilitating the discovery process for the new special DAs.
What are your top priorities now that you're in this post?
The first priority of mine was simply to be here, to be around the office, and to be involved in all the decision making, to make sure that it's a place where people want to be every day. So I've spent a lot of time moving around the office, meeting everybody. It's funny, when I left, I had a lot of friends that worked here, but when I came back, there were probably only about 20 of them left out of 190 people. So I had about 170 new people to meet. So it's taken some time, but I'm making an effort to be sure that I'm around the office and being supportive of everyone. My other major priority, though, is to create and implement a very robust training program for this office from start to finish.
What does that training program entail?
Well, I'm working to get the position settled so that I can hire someone for it, it would be a full-time position. It would be someone who's an experienced prosecutor and who could handle, 2 or 3 or maybe 4 high-profile cases or homicide cases. But the full-time day-to-day job that they would have would be to be creating and implementing, with my assistance, a training program for all new ADAs who start in the office. To return the office to biannual, or semi-annual, continuing legal education classes that are full-day classes for all of the new and experienced attorneys in the office. They would also be responsible for sort of fixing issues in real time, right? They can go and watch trials, they can talk to the bureau chiefs, find out what issues they're seeing with their ADAs on trial, and address those issues in real time so that any mistakes that might have been made can be rectified and education can go out to the whole office. They would also be responsible for implementing policy and procedure with the input from the administration. And I think that covers it for the most part. But it would be a full-time job.
The 2004, I believe, cold case, in the Kuhn murder case, where does that go from here? For those who don't remember, the charges were recently dropped over evidence issues where there may have been a in-jail confession to another inmate. Where do we go from here with that case?
Well, from our perspective, the case is simply over, unless some other new evidence is developed that would allow us to reopen the case. When you're working on a cold case, you often have to do what's called a Singer hearing. This gets to a defendant's constitutional speedy rights, or speedy trial rights, excuse me. So statutory speedy trial rights don't apply to homicides, and statute of limitations don't apply to homicides, but everyone is still afforded their constitutional right to a speedy trial. And if a lengthy enough period of time has passed, then you have to prove to the judge that you have enough sufficient new evidence such that the period of time that passed wasn't unreasonable. And in that case, initially, our office was told in 2018, or maybe in 2020 or so, that there had been a confession in 2018, or that RPD had learned about it in 2018. And we were able to go forward based on the fact that that was newer evidence. As it came to pass, we found out that that information was actually known to an individual at RPD back in 2005 when it actually occurred, rendering it not new evidence at all. And so we had done the Singer hearing already. We had won the Singer hearing. We were allowed to proceed based on that. And once the court found out that it wasn't new, the court had no choice but to say that it was an unreasonable delay and dismiss the matter on speedy trial grounds. And so unless there's new evidence that would justify the delay, the case is over.
What do you think about that?
It's heartbreaking. Everybody that works in this office does it because their heart is in it. They find it to be not to sound cliche, but a just and noble cause. And they spend countless hours preparing cases for trial. And cold cases are exceptionally difficult. You find that witnesses are no longer around or have even passed on. You find that some evidence has been destroyed due to retention schedules and things like that. It makes it very, very difficult to prosecute a cold case. And Pat and Sarah had done an amazing job working with RPD to get that case ready for trial. And it was the last thing any of us wanted. And it was a heartbreaking decision to bring that evidence forward. But the decision was actually relatively easy to make because it's what the law required.
Yeah, because if it were to come out later on too, that would be a big problem.
Yeah, and you can't start to shade the truth. As soon as you start to do that on any case that you handle, you, A, lose credibility and you lose the reputation you've spent years building, but B, it undercuts every other case that you or the office ever handles. And that's not worth it. We want to continue to do good work for everybody that we can, and unfortunately sometimes that means you have to let a case go.
When I first came back to town in 2011, there was a shift underway within the DA's office to focus more on opioids. which is so hard because it's seen by many as a disease, the addiction itself. And then there's, separate almost handling of it within the judicial system. Where do you see that going in our community?
That's a really good question. From my perspective, I see the prosecution side being less focused than it already is on individual users of opioids. We'll still fully prosecute every dealer of opioids that we can. And we're involved in the task force groups, or whatever you might want to call it, about the opioid overdose epidemic. And we'll continue that work as well. We actually have an investigator from this office permanently assigned to the opioid task force. And we intend to continue any work we can to reduce the use of opioids in the community, and certainly to try to bring down the number of tragic deaths.
How did you get into this field?
So it's kind of a funny story, because when I first went to law school, I had no intention of practicing law. I intended to finish law school and get a master's in public policy and go in an entirely different direction. But the first summer after I started law school, I got an externship with a federal judge in Ohio. And at the end of the summer, his junior clerk left chambers early to go be a senior clerk in another chambers, and he hired me on full-time to finish out her term as clerk. So I had to switch to the evening program at school. And working with Judge Smith, I found out pretty quickly that I actually really like this stuff. So I never took a single environmental class, went through law school, and in Ohio I worked for the Ohio Secretary of State as elections counsel. And then my wife and I had our first child, and we wanted to move home. So I was trying to think of things that I could do back here when we moved home. And while I was finishing my undergrad here, I was working for Starbucks, which is a great opportunity for students because you can get benefits for part-time work, and so that sort of helped us along the way. But I was a victim of an armed robbery at one of the Starbucks here in Rochester. And then in Ohio, my wife and I were burglarized, and we lost a tremendous amount of property, some of it very sentimental, some of it very important for her academic work, for example. And so when we were moving back, I chose to apply to the district attorney's office.
We're kind of inspired by that. Was that a hard switch for you? Because, correct me if I'm wrong, you were doing some defense work. You were in the public defender's office at one point?
Secretary of State's office.
Secretary, okay.
Yeah, so I was in-house counsel. Okay. The Secretary of State in Ohio actually oversees elections statewide. So I had a quarter of the county boards of elections that I was counsel to, along with the secretary, and we spent about 2 years revamping Ohio's election system after the 2006 midterms prior to the 2008 presidential.
Okay. It's a in the weeds kind of job, I'm sure.
Yeah, very much so.
While you were here in the Monroe County DA's office, are there any cases that stood out to you that you kind of hang your hat on, or they just left a mark because of the emotions attached to it?
Yeah, there are a lot. Some of the hardest cases to deal with were some of the arson homicides that I prosecuted. There was one case where there was a domestic dispute, and a gentleman lit the front porch on fire, and that was actually the only way to get out of the house at the time. The family had to go upstairs and eventually had to jump out a second floor window, and a little girl that lived there sat on the windowsill waiting for her mother to come to the window so long that her arms were burned before she finally jumped. And her mother, unfortunately, was scared of heights and had tried to hide herself away to avoid the fire inside the house and didn't survive. Those kinds of cases really have an impact on you. Both of those kids had to testify, and it's, I give incredible credit to our special victims unit, because working with children in those circumstances is incredibly difficult. You know that it's going to have an impact on them for the rest of their lives. So those definitely have an impact. The homicide of the murder of Rochester police officer Darrell Pearson was probably the most difficult case that I handled. Even though the trial itself was fairly straightforward, the emotional impact and the media pressure and the pressure, inadvertent from the Rochester Police Department was just immense. But the trial was incredibly rewarding as well.
That's interesting because, yeah, the evidence was what it was, but at the same time, all eyes were on the office and you, so.
And I tried that with Sandra, and it was definitely one of the most difficult periods of time I had in the office. And then, of course, you also have cases. I had a month-long homicide trial with Judge Dinolfo and with John Parinello on defense, and just handling a trial for that long, day in and day out, takes a physical and emotional toll on you. So the job is difficult, and I want to be here just to support everybody who's doing those kinds of trials day in and day out.
Are there any DAs that have been mentors to you, whether they've been hands-on mentors or just role models where you try to follow their example?
Yeah. I used to watch Mike and Sandra do trials, and they were inspiring in their trial work. Perry Duckles, the first assistant, took me on when I first moved to felonies in the driving while intoxicated bureau. And then when he came up to be the chief of major felonies, he brought me up with him as well. He constantly mentored me and provided me incredible opportunity. I'm sure he probably took a little flack for some of the responsibility that he gave me as a younger ADA, but he had faith in me, and I can never repay that.
So you're a registered Democrat. You got appointed. When I was speaking with some of the GOP leadership in town, before you were even named as a potential, they had said, we wouldn't mind if Brian Green gets appointed, although we'd love a Republican if it's going to be a Democrat. Why do you think that you received their tacit approval?
I mean, first of all, that's incredibly flattering, and I appreciate the sentiment. Obviously, I don't know what's in their mind, but I guess if I had to guess, I would say that it's probably because I've always tried to maintain a very open and candid position on everything that I do. I try not to hide the ball, and I try to do the right thing on every case. Even, you've probably heard me say before, even as I teach now or over the last several years, when I'm talking to students about what prosecutors do, I tell them that in my view, the job is to do the right thing on every case every day. And I think that's all you can ask of from a district attorney or a district attorney's office, is to handle the cases appropriately. Sometimes that means sending someone to life or to prison for the rest of their life without the opportunity for parole. And sometimes it means watching a cold case that people have been working tirelessly on get dismissed, like we saw a couple weeks ago. And so I think the community probably is best served by someone who's willing to recognize that sometimes you have to make those tough decisions and let things go, but when you don't have to do that, you're working tirelessly to protect the community. So I suspect it's probably something of that balance.
There were a lot of folks in law enforcement initially and since then who have pushed back on some of the bail reform, some of the criminal justice reform, specifically bail reform, saying there needs to be more flexibility, discretion for judges and whatnot, and they point to these cases where someone gets let out and commits another crime. What's your take on bail reform and where it should go, or are you happy where it is right now?
It's funny, as a judge, I couldn't speak about that at all. You can't comment on the state of the law. And I've only been back here about 3 weeks, not quite 4 weeks. So I guess in that short period of time, thinking about it again as a prosecutor, I think that there probably are opportunities to see it broaden to some extent, but in New York, it's still true that the only reason to set bail on an individual is to ensure they return to court. And if we hold true to that principle, then I think maybe there could be a little bit more discretion or make a few other kinds of cases bail qualifying. But I think the judges do have some discretion, and I think that, first of all, the judges have some more discretion than people let on. But also, and I'll be candid about this, I think this office was not making some of the applications that they needed to make in order to give judges discretion. Right? It's still true that the only reason for bail in New York is to ensure someone's returned to court, but for the first time in New York's history, we also have a public safety exception to that rule, which is what people refer to, I've seen in the news lately, as harm on harm. Right? There's an exception that says if someone is currently at liberty while facing charges that identify a particular harm to a particular person or entity, and they are then charged with another crime of that same sort, if the prosecutor makes the application, the judge can consider the new case as bail qualifying. Right? So if that application's made, then the judges do have some discretion to set bail. And a couple of weeks ago in the news, there was a case about an individual who had been arrested 6 or 7 times in the prior month or so. And his latest arrests had been out of the town of Irondequoit. And there were times when prosecutors in this office didn't make the harm on harm application. But I've gone back and I've looked at the records, and there were times when the prosecutors did make the harm on harm exception, on, for example, a 4th or 5th arrest, and the judges still wouldn't set bail. Instead, they released under various ways to release. So I think that judges probably can take a closer look when we make that application to decide whether bail is warranted instead of always erring on the side of release. But that takes us making the application too.
That's interesting. So perhaps not, in your eyes, there is some of that discretion that they want. It's already built in. It just may take a little more work in certain circumstances.
Yeah, it might take us making more applications than we've made in the past, and I haven't gotten to the bottom of why we might not be making those applications. But that is something that I'll be addressing. But then when we do make those applications, I'm not saying bail is required on every case. And obviously it is up to the judges. They have that discretion, but when someone's on their 5th or 6th arrest in a month of cases that are all bail qualifying because they were already released on one that was similar but not bail qualifying, I would hope that some of the judges would consider that and hold someone on bail. That is one of those times when they're allowed to hold someone on bail for something other than just the return to court.
We're seeing this play out in Ontario County, the hate crime with the Nordquist case. And I've heard people debate on a hate crime, saying a crime is a crime and there's hate involved no matter what. Do you think there should be a separate set of charges when it involves a crime against someone, I'm drawing a blank on the term, not underrepresented, but you probably know it better than I, when it targets someone in a
protected class.
There it is. I'm sorry. Yes.
Well, it's a really slippery slope because the reason that they have hate crime classifications is because in order to treat it more exceptionally, you need to prove that the motivating factor was in fact the hate for whatever protected class we're talking about. To allow for prosecution on an assault case, for example, to a harsher extent without having to prove some additional animus sort of runs counter to our general philosophy in criminal justice. The legislatures, in New York, around the country, they certainly could take that next step to say the motivating factor doesn't have to be an animus toward that protected class. We could add a harsher penalty if in fact the person is of a protected class. I think the danger in that, though, is that you will be punishing similarly situated people more harshly for a fact that they had no knowledge or control over. And I think that given the history of criminal justice in the country, that's a dangerous step to take. We have the hate crime classifications, and I think that those are warranted, but they are also somewhat difficult to prove.
Interesting. Do you think that district attorney races should even involve traditional political parties?
You know, in Ohio, where I lived for about 7 years, even the judges don't run on political lines. And I do think that that would be a better system for judges and prosecutors. You know, I have to be a politician in order to get and keep this job. But it's not a political office. It can't be a political office. Now, I said at my swearing in that I won't you know, sacrifice the safety of the community for ideology, and part of that gets to politics. I won't allow my assistants, and I won't handle cases in a way that's different simply because of some, you know, political moment out in the world. Right? This office is based on law and ethics, and in prosecuting cases, we don't take politics into account. So I don't understand then why the appointment or election of a person such as myself should be based on those same politics. And don't get me wrong, I'm humbled and honored to have this position, to have been appointed by Governor Hochul, and I'll do the best that I can every day, but you know, it's not a political office.
The message that I'm getting from this interview is that you try to stay true to the law that's in front of you, whether you agree with it or not. What is it about the law in and of itself that makes it so sacrosanct to you?
It's what our entire society is built on, right? There are quotes from lots of legal and political philosophers about this, you know, but in some sense, you know, things become chaotic and dangerous if we don't follow the rule of law. Everything we do in life is based on law. Just going to the grocery store, for example, and buying a loaf of bread is based on the rule of law, because there are untold numbers of contracts that led to that loaf of bread being on the grocery store shelf, right? I used to teach contracts to the paralegal program at MCC. That's one of the examples that I would use with them. You know, you've got everything from the company selling the seeds to the farmers, and the farmers buying the seeds and buying the tractors and buying the other equipment, and then the wholesale distribution agreements, and you know, it's just contract after contract after contract, right? Everything in our life is structured that same way. It might not be just in contract law or not just in criminal justice, but these principles that we live by and adhere to govern everything we do. And I think that's incredibly important. And if we shy away from that, or if we shirk those responsibilities, we contribute to the chipping away of the rule of law, and we chip away at the society that we've built.
Brian Green, thank you so much for this time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Get the Rochester First streaming app today for everything you love from News 8 On Demand, plus exclusive shows you won't see anywhere else. Search ROC and download for free on Roku, Amazon Fire, and Apple TV.